Dick Cheney said what?
Look who's talking.
This morning there was an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal.
Quote, rarely has a U.S. president been so wrong about so much at the expense of so many.
Who would write that? How about Dick Cheney?
Former Vice President Dick Cheney.
Chief architect of the war.
He's out there attacking President Obama over Iraq.
You amaze me.
Quote, rarely has a U.S. president been so wrong about so much.
Which president was he talking about?
Cheney is not talking about the U.S. president who led America into a bloodbath based on ginned up and faulty intelligence.
President Obama has repeatedly misled the American people.
No. Dick Cheney is talking about President Obama.
Pretending that he, Dick Cheney, wasn't the perpetrator of the disaster.
I want to be as respectful as possible to Vice President Cheney.
How preposterous. The man is shameless.
I cannot find the words to say how I feel.
I don't think he's the one to be giving us advice.
We hope you will join us
Unfortunately, we've already tried it your way.
in the hard but necessary task of restoring American strength and power.
It was the biggest foreign policy blunder in the history of the country.
We're forming the Alliance for a Strong America.
An organization to defend America and attack Barack Obama.
We hope you will join us.
Thanks, but no thanks.
Good evening, I'm Ari Melber in for Lawrence O'Donnell. We begin tonight with a development that is bad for Republicans and good for our foreign policy debate in this country, the falling stock of Dick Cheney. Now, to appreciate just how far he has fallen, consider his standing at the beginning of the Obama presidency. When President Obama delivered one of his first major national security addresses in May 2009, the recently departed vice president wanted in on the action. So he watched that speech on a stage at a conservative think tank and then dramatically gave his live response. Back then, yes, of course, many Americans already knew that Dick Cheney's foreign policy was a failure. We just finished a whole election about change. But Cheney was still treated as a major foreign policy force. Official Washington treated him that way. A lot of the press treated him that way. And so his attempt to position himself as the de facto official response to the president, like some sort of State of the Union rebuttal, was diligently reflected by politicos and a lot of the press.
President Obama stood firm today on his policies for fighting terror and closing the prison at Guantanamo. And former Vice President Cheney answered with a defense of Bush administration policies and new challenges to Mr. Obama.
And there was lots of coverage like that, you might remember. Obama said this, Cheney said that, and cable news channels, including this one, studiously ran split-screen coverage that day. Dick Cheney, right now, still lives in a world where he's on par with President Obama issuing his responses, but the rest of the world is moving on. So where did Cheney take his rebuttal today? To YouTube.
I'm Liz Cheney.
I'm Dick Cheney. We stand at a critical moment in the life of our nation. The policies of the last 6 years have left America diminished and weakened. Our enemies no longer fear us. Our allies no longer trust us. Empty threats, meaningless red lines, leading from behind, and engagement with rogue regimes have put America on a path of decline. Threats to America's security are on the rise.
The Cheneys also announced a new organization there to advance that cause. They amplified their message with a Wall Street Journal op-ed and a joint appearance on Fox News. This new group, Alliance for a Stronger America, says it will, quote, educate about and advocate for the policies needed to restore American power and preeminence, something Cheney's been trying to do since Barack Obama's election.
Now he's making some choices that, in my mind, will in fact raise the risk to the American people of another attack.
We're, 3 months into the new administration. I don't think there are members of al-Qaeda out there around the world this morning saying, oh, gee whiz, isn't that great? Barack Obama and his administration are no longer going to ask our guys tough questions.
President Obama now seems afraid to make a decision. The White House must stop dithering, waffling while our troops on the ground face an emboldened enemy, endangers them and hurts our cause.
I think Barack Obama is a one-term president.
He wanted to take us down a peg. To the extent there's an extremist or radical political view in Washington these days, I believe it's the President of the United States. He's a very, very weak president, maybe the weakest, certainly in my lifetime.
And back over some of those years, reporters would present Cheney's critique directly to President Obama.
I fundamentally disagree with Dick Cheney.
But tonight, even in the potentially friendly bubble of Fox News, it was actually Cheney who had to answer attacks on his own record.
In your op-ed, you write as follows: rarely has a U.S. president been so wrong about so much at the expense of so many. But time and time again, history has proven that you got it wrong as well in Iraq, sir. With almost $1 trillion spent there, with 4,500 American lives lost there, what do you say to those who say you were so wrong about so much at the expense of so many?
No, I just fundamentally disagree, Megan.
Now let's take a step back. Today, everyone in politics is buzzing about this return of Dick Cheney. But please don't call it a comeback. I think we're witnessing something that's actually rare in politics, because so often the vanity of failed politicos keeps them out of the spotlight at inopportune times. Dick Cheney does not have that compunction, so he's emerged at the very nadir of his policy and political credibility. Republicans don't want him. Democrats don't fear him. Fox News doesn't trust him. And YouTube, you can have him. Joining me now, Richard Wolff, executive editor of MSNBC.com, and Jonathan Chait, a columnist for New York Magazine. Good evening, gentlemen. Richard, what are we to make of what I'm not calling a comeback of Dick Cheney?
Well, I think, to coin a phrase, this is the last throes, if you will, of Dick Cheney. And look, here is a man who purports to say that the president has allowed al-Qaeda to take a foothold in Iraq. Let's just revisit a little bit of history. Before Dick Cheney led the decision to invade Iraq and led the disastrous occupation of Iraq, there was no al-Qaeda in Iraq. He allowed al-Qaeda to get a foothold in Iraq. He knows that full well. He elides through history, picks and chooses what he wants. As you point out, not only does he have no credibility, he doesn't have any throw weight, as they say in the military.
No throw weight and not a lot of support. It's family members that want to be in these YouTube videos, not a lot of other Republicans. Jonathan, you also zeroed in on the Wall Street Journal op-ed and the sort of linguistic halfway charges of treason that are danced around there. You write, throughout their column, the Cheneys continually tiptoe up to the line of accusing Obama of treason without quite stepping over. And then just a few moments ago, Megyn Kelly in this interview was asking Cheney about what the nonprofit will do. Take a listen to that.
Tell us how you think, this nonprofit group can do anything to stop a president.
Well, for one thing, Megan, we think it's an opportunity to get out and talk about these issues in a very objective fashion.
Square that with your reporting on his writings.
Right. Well, obviously, what he's trying to do isn't objective. And I would say that you framed the issue in a really interesting way, but there's one missing piece, which is that Dick Cheney now has to fight a battle within the Republican Party. He used to completely represent Republican foreign policy thought, but under President Obama, there's been a much higher growth of anti-interventionist thought, just as there was under President Clinton, because when your party is out of power, you become much more distrustful of the use of power and of the government. So this whole strain of anti-interventionist thought that has been led by Rand Paul but has really gained a following among a lot of Republicans is a dire threat to Cheney's ability to even speak for the Republican Party, which was taken for granted as recently as 2009.
Yeah, and that's a significant difference in the war of foreign policy ideas. Glenn Beck, who also has a lot of purchase here in the grassroots, did something pretty remarkable that's also worth listening to. Let's hear that.
Yep.
Not one more life. Not one more life. Not one more dollar, not one more airplane, not one more bullet, not one more Marine, not one more arm or leg or eye, not one more. The people of Iraq have got to work this out themselves. Our days of being the world's policeman, our days of interventionists is over. If we are directly attacked, so be it. But this must end now. This cannot become about the Democrats. This has to become about the principles, because in the principles we all agree. enough is enough. Bring them home. Period.
Richard.
Extraordinary moment. I mean, it is an extraordinary moment. That sentiment is widespread. People who care about the armed forces understand that as well. And, you know, you have to look at what underscores that. It isn't just about the suffering and the tremendous cost. It's a sense that Iraq has to be a sovereign nation, has to be responsible for its own future. If America is seeking endless war and endless occupation, then it is no longer true to what people like Glenn Beck say, which is America's tradition of being a constitutional power, not a colonial power. And that's what I think Dick Cheney is way out of the mainstream, was way out of the mainstream of Republican thinking at the time. Remember, the pillar of Republican thinking now, Ronald Reagan, never launched anything like what we saw in Iraq, not even in Afghanistan.
So let me go, Jonathan, briefly, are there other conservatives who will tell the Cheneys to pipe down?
Oh, sure. He's really at war with Rand Paul, and even the Ted Cruzes aren't going to like him very much. And he's just a terrible symbol of the past for that party. So they have no interest in having Dick Cheney coming out and being the face of the party.
All right, Richard Wolff and Jonathan Chait, thank you both for joining me as we go from YouTube to TV and back again. Coming up, why Republicans are letting Laura Ingraham call the shots and what you're not seeing at the World Cup. Also, chipping away at the defenses of Dan Snyder and Washington, D.C.'s controversial football team name. That's tonight.